Welcome everybody to this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. My name is Ibrahim Anoba. I am managing editor of African Liberty, and African Liberty is a project of Students for Liberty, founded in 2007 to disseminate ideas of freedom and opinion about public policy from young Africans, particularly those on the continent of Africa. And today we are having this discussion about the epistemic decolonization of African stories. So to help us understand this question and make a better sense of it, we have three amazing individuals. But before I go to the introduction of our guests, I'd like to also introduce my colleague, Anna Suberu, who is a writing fellow at African Liberty, and also our communications person. So right into the guests. So Yemisi Adegoke is a senior journalist and reporter with BBC News, covering West Africa. Yemisi is passionate about telling stories from around the continent. She is a multimedia personality who writes on culture, politics, and feminism. She holds a master's degree in journalism from Arthur L. Carter Institute at New York University. Yemisi is the host and producer of Behind All the Stories, a podcast for storytellers and journalists. Welcome, Yemisi Adegoke. It's a pleasure to have you, and I hope you are able to switch on your video and audio. Next is Nelson Abbey, who is a British-Nigerian writer, media professional, and satirist. He is a published author who is the co-founder of the Black Writers Guild. He is the co-author of the book How to Think Like a White Man, where he discusses the challenges of being a Black professional in a white corporate world. Welcome, Nels.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And the amazing Professor Bernard Matolino, who is a professor of philosophy at KwaZulu-Natal University, South Africa. He is the author of several books on African philosophy, democracy, and theology. His research interests are on topics related to race, racism, and African philosophy. It's a pleasure to have each of you, but let's jump right into it. I don't know if you are able to hear me, Professor Matolino. I think it went off again. But both Yemisi and Nels, could you kindly help us, set in motion, from the most rudimentary angle of explanation, what we mean by decolonizing African stories? What is wrong with African stories? Why do we need to decolonize it? And what do we gain from decolonization of African stories? Just a very basic explanation of what that means. I don't know if you can go first, Nels, while we wait for Yemisi to be ready.
Yeah, but I believe, hold on, I think I'm showing. I believe that showing is often better than telling. So as opposed to me telling you what the colonizing of African stories is, I'd rather just show you. So on your screen in front of you is actually a shelf of the African history shelf in a shop called Waterstones in a place called Tottenham Court Road in London, in central London, which is one of the main shopping districts in the United Kingdom. And this is also one of the one of their flagship shops. So this is the African history shelf. And practically, I noticed that I took this picture in 2019, and what it shows is that not even practically, every single book there, I believe, barring just one single book, every single book about Africa here is written by Europeans. So every last perspective of African history offered to the general public, the mainstream general public in Britain, Britain in London, which is a very diverse city, is written exclusively from the perspective of Europeans, barring Achebe's autobiographical book, and I believe perhaps actually even the book on Mandela is also written by Europeans too. So I think that actually gives you the extent of actual colonization of the writing and thinking on Africa, and the decolonizing of it. I view it in very simple terms, which is to actually place the power to tell African stories back into the hands of Africans. So I mean, Africans should be able to tell their own story and tell them very, very well with more skill than anybody else. Nobody would take the perspective of an African seriously, or no one wants to hear the African perspective of Brexit. No one's going to want to listen to that whatsoever. And it's the same way too that no one should, that the British or European perspective on Africa should not be the primary source of information on it in the slightest. That's me.
Okay, that's interesting because I'm doing a PhD in African history, and majority of the books we read about, colonial Africa, pre-colonial Africa, up until maybe the early 21st century, or let's say the late 20th century, were written by European anthropologists, historians who were trying to make sense of African cultures and African imagination. And of course, there's this new surge by, both Africa-trained scholars, African scholars in Europe and America, and American scholars who are Africanists, to sort of change this very esoteric ideas and the ways we write about Africa by, involving African voices in African stories, and actually looking at African history or African imagination from below, not from the empire perspective. So I really reckon with your point, Abbey. But Yemisi, can you help us understand from the perspective of a journalist what it means to decolonize African stories or tell African stories from African perspectives?
Sure. So I think, what Nels showed was very powerful, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that this isn't just about history. This is something that's still, currently happening in spaces like journalism, in spaces like academia. And I think it's important to make clear that this is not about gatekeeping, because I think whenever this topic comes up, there's always the argument of gatekeeping. Are you saying that only African people can tell African stories, or only X people can tell these types of stories? And I think it's more about acknowledging and interrogating some of the power dynamics that are attached to sort of knowledge production, and how, stories about Africa have been informed by colonialism, racism, imperialism. It's about who gets to decide what counts as knowledge, who gets to decide what stories are told, who is creating these stories and why, who is profiting from these stories and why. So an example that I like to give is, in journalism, we tend to have people that are called fixers. I personally don't like that term. These are essentially journalists and producers who are hired for stories because of their sort of local understanding. So it could be of a place, it could be of they could have access, they may be able to understand a language or context, or be able to provide a certain lived experience. And these people are essentially the ones that can get you in. And they're instrumental in the sort of process behind the story, and also in sort of telling the story, but they don't really have that much impact on the end product. Sometimes these people don't even end up being credited, but without them, the stories would not happen. So it's stuff like that. It's about interrogating those relationships and, highlighting our own privileges as sort of storytellers. And this, and I'm sure we'll get into this later, this also includes people within the diaspora. This is not just about white people, although there are obviously levels to this, but it's about people in privileged positions acknowledging their privileges and trying to dismantle some of these power structures that have informed a lot of stories.
Certainly, that's really powerful. I don't know if Anna has a question, but what you just said, Yemisi, reminds me of one of the beauty of working with African scholars, those who have experience from the African continent, perhaps their first or second degree, then transited to the US or Europe. There's this beautiful scholar in, I think, University of California, Santa Barbara, called Mose Chikwere. He produced a very beautiful book about one of the perspectives of history of Zimbabwe, colonial Zimbabwe. But at the end of the book, he was sure to highlight strongly the voices of the people, the locals, who actually helped him construct that monograph. Like, this monograph would have been possible without these people, and I'm going to dedicate a whole chapter for them just telling their stories. I'm not going to edit anything. It's 100% their stories. So I really reckon with what you said, Yemisi, that sometimes the local informants work or use certain stories are not properly credited. And of course, this is part of this general idea of not properly involving African in African stories. Anna, do you have a question before I go ahead with my next question?
Yes, thank you, Ibrahim, and thanks to our guests for their contribution so far. So Yemisi, I'd just like to bring you in once more to talk on maybe your experience as a journalist, and when you talk about how these publishers and basically the producers try to cut out certain aspects of stories, or they make it harder for the actual lived experiences for Africans to be told. So as a journalist, how do you tackle this when you encounter such?
I think it can be really difficult. I'll be honest, like as a journalist, if you're working within an organization, there's only so much you can really do. Obviously, in terms of ethics, of course, you push forward and try to ensure that everybody is properly credited. I do think that trying to help not only people who inform your stories, but also sort of younger local journalists who may not have the same access as you. Like I have lived and worked in Nigeria for about 10 years. I am Nigerian, but I was brought up in the UK. So I'm very aware that I have a certain level of privilege that other journalists in Nigeria don't necessarily have, given the sort of organizations I've worked for also. So I think part of, again, acknowledging your privilege is when you see people who are also trying to gain access into spaces that they may not necessarily be able to try to help them do that as well. So of course, properly crediting people, also trying to nurture younger journalists and push for sort of local media organizations that are also doing powerful stories. It's not just about the big, and I understand that, with bigger companies, you do sometimes get like bigger impact. There's more money to kind of tell stories, but there are a lot of really, really amazing homegrown media companies that are doing amazing work. And those voices also need to be amplified. They need to be supported during the NSARS protests. And I always use this as an example. I feel like it was a great sort of example of how the diaspora and the continent can work together, because a lot of the news was coming from here and people in the diaspora were amplifying it. You saw media organizations like Zikoko, like Republic Journal, Steers Business, putting out amazing content. These are local organizations. Only they would have been able to tell the story the way they told that story. And people outside were trying to nurture that, trying to support that, amplify that, financially support it where they can. So I feel like those are kinds of things you can do. Obviously, you do what you can within your own. Like I do what I can as a journalist here, making sure that everybody who's involved in any story that I'm working on, whether it's the producer or the driver or, local producers, making sure they're all credited, trying to make sure that everybody feels like they were a part of the story, because without all those elements, the story wouldn't exist. But also on a bigger level, trying to support and nurture younger journalists who don't necessarily have the same access to spaces, and supporting local journalism, local media organizations that are trying to tell authentic stories.
Thanks, Yemisi. I really agree with you when it comes to amplifying stories from Africans. So we actually do not tend to distort their perspective. But Nels, real quick, I'd like to ask you, I don't know if you followed the occurrence when Trish Lawrence wrote a book that used the NSAS chant as the title. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of feedback of people saying how this book did not represent the actual struggle against police brutality. And basically there was a lot of outrage about it. But following that outrage, at the end of the day, nothing was done. And it was just like, okay, yes, we said a few things about it, but everybody has moved on to their normal lives and all of that. So are there ways we can actually hold authors and researchers accountable for when they distort certain narratives? Nels?
So the purpose of any form of demonstration, for example, is to market an injustice, is to make clear that something wrong is prevailing here and it has to be addressed. So the first stage of that is to actually just reflect upon that fact that, look, what happened with Trish, I can't remember the lady's name, but I've just heard Trish. What happened with Trish's book was to some degree largely sacred, an abomination when you think about it, that people really truly did die, that there was a massacre, and the outcome of the actual massacre, the slogan permeated for the massacre, or the hashtag permeated for the massacre, was hijacked by an author who was awarded very, 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 very handsomely for writing a book just by slapping the slogan on the front of the book. It's almost like during the days of the Mau Mau, for example, to write a book under the term Uhuru or something just like that. It would be the exact same thing. It's kind of disgusting. But the first point of something what happens in social media is to market the injustice. The second point is to actually try and remedy the injustice to make sure things are actually done properly. The approach we've taken in Britain, the Black writers also, is to come together. We've formed a guild of Black writers where when there's something like this actually happens, what we do is that we go forward to the actual publishing house and make it clear that we're not happy with what has actually happened over here. And we have our set of actual objectives to say to them that, and here's how we wish to remedy and here's how we wish to rectify it. Now, when it comes to these things such as publishing and everything else, so these are very, very white worlds. So very, very often, something like what happened in the Sorosoke book would have gone over the heads of most people who probably worked on the entire book, and they probably didn't have the cultural skill or nous to really just say, actually, this is not actually appropriate. There should have been somebody in the mix there, but there just wasn't, and it happened. What happened? But what happened has happened ever since. So I think the first step was great. Take to Twitter, take to streets, take to wherever to protest an injustice, market the injustice, make it clear what's happened. The second step is to, what do you want? And then you push back and get your concessions from there, and then hopefully we all build a better and brighter world.
All right, thanks for that, Nels. And connecting with your work with Black Writers Guild, I'd like to know, when it comes to holding literary agents accountable, at the end of the day, do you feel it's better for Africans, as much as, like you said, it's a white world, do you feel it's better for Black writers and Africans to create platforms for themselves so that our stories can actually be heard in our own way? Or should we just still try to make sure we're heard on mainstream media, and that turns out to mostly be Western media?
It's a good one. So it goes back to what Yemisi said earlier on, that so a lot of what, to really get authentic African stories and really sometimes really get things through is actually very, very difficult. My first book was a book called Think Like a White Man, which was as black as it gets as far as the book was concerned. I was even surprised I found a publisher of myself too, but it did in the end. But it took a lot to get there, and even getting it through the editorial process and everything else was very difficult, caused me a lot of stress. And I'm sure it cost the editor and the publishing company a lot of stress too, because whenever you're doing something creative, there's so much subjectivity there that a lot of people aren't going to get things, and you just move forward from there. And it's a work of compromise to get the best job out of it. The hope is that you don't compromise too far, and that you compromise enough to just get it just right, and it builds an audience from there. But as far as actual African publishing houses are concerned, or Black Western publishing houses are concerned, or anything else, got to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I think that also too, it's part of the sphere of competition, a creator of giving readers the best story possible. So there are African publishing houses that operate in the UK, be it Jacaranda, I believe is it Cassava or Calabash? I think it's Cassava Publishing. So there are actual publishing houses that operate within the United Kingdom that are I believe they're both Nigerian, the two I just mentioned. So they do, and they compete. They punch above their weight. They have distribution deals with the big publishing houses, and they move forward from there. So I think it's important. But just to mention what Yemisi said, that you need those people who really understand the local landscape, who really understand what's actually happening on the ground, who can really understand the culture, and there's no need for that the baggage or the tax of cultural translation to really be an issue in terms of the book. So you need that. But at the same time too, if you want your book to reach as wide an audience as possible, you need the machine publishers too. So it's a balance between the two of them. But small things grow big. So even the smaller African publishers, who knows where they'll be tomorrow. And also Africa's got is a massive market that often isn't tapped into anywhere broadly enough. So it could be a significantly vast publishing powerhouse if we just got things perfectly tweaked together or so and got them in place. There's no reason why the African publishing houses can't really be, in terms of pound for pound, dollar for dollar, couldn't be just as big or even better than the European houses and the American houses too.
Thanks, Nels. I'll bring Ibrahim in right now.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thanks for the point, Nels and Yemisi. But I want to iterate to the audience that you can actually ask your questions by posting them in the Q&A box. I will be sure to ask them during the course of the conversation. But I want to ask this very sort of controversial question. So I mean, I do history and some part of anthropology and African studies, and there is no denying the fact that, I mean, part of the people who actually set in motion this idea of decolonizing African stories were European scholars. For example, Karim Baba, you can't really study Nigeria without reading about Karim Baba's work. Or Adam Hochschild is a journalist who wrote King Leopold's Ghost. Very popular book, but that was an American journalist. Now we know about all the crazy things that King Leopold did in Congo. Also, you have like someone like Jan Van Sina, who was a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, who set in motion this idea of using African oral traditions. So these are white, scholars, but are Africanists as well. So I'm wondering, Yemisi, there are people who say, this idea of decolonizing African stories is sort of racist or discriminatory, that you're only saying only Africans can actually write genuinely about African stories or African situations. How do you respond to that as a journalist? Does that allegation have substance?
I think that's a good question, and as I said earlier, I think that's something that people, whenever this conversation comes around, it's an allegation that's leveled that this is about gatekeeping, and it's not. It's looking at the fact that people, when you're sort of producing knowledge, you're coming with your own sort of biases and your own experiences. I think that one of the issues, and I've mentioned this a few times before, that we see, white people often in these spaces is because there seems to be the belief that white people are somehow neutral when it comes to these matters. That if an African person is writing about African history or telling African stories, that we're too emotionally involved, or we won't be able to give an objective perspective. But when you look at the history of the continent in terms of colonialism, in terms of the slave trade, in terms of imperialism, white people are not neutral either. Nobody is neutral within this, but they have been given this label and everybody has sort of run with it. I also think it's worth looking at the fact that, white people are within a very small group of people that can go into other people's countries. And again, it's because of this idea of objectivity. They can go there, report on whatever they like, and be given access. Whereas, me as a journalist, for example, if I turned around and said I wanted to go to Japan to write about low birth rates, I'm an experienced journalist. I've worked for over a decade in this field. Very few people would be willing to commission me because they would ask me, do you speak Japanese? What do you know about Japanese culture? What access do you have to Japan? What makes you qualified to tell this story? And these are questions that are not leveled at my white counterparts. There are plenty of people that come to various countries in Africa. They cannot speak any African languages. This is perhaps their first big reporting trip. There are people that have only been journalists for maybe a year, 2 years. And I think the thing about the continent, or with anywhere in terms of storytelling, but in journalism and in academia specifically, these are not just stories that go out there. They start to then inform policy. And that's where, we're seeing the real impact of this type of stuff. This is not just about opinions. This is stuff that now filters back to governments, that makes decisions about, where military bases should be placed, or how elections should be covered, or how this sort of informs the future of a country. So it's not about saying that people cannot tell certain stories. It's about, fairness for starters, because some people are allowed to tell stories and other people are not given those same opportunities. But it's also about, again, interrogating the power dynamics at play when people are telling stories, because white people, I live in Nigeria. I've had plenty of amazing white colleagues come out here, and we've collaborated on many stories together. When we enter a situation, you can see the shift because white people are not neutral. And it's the same way that when I walk into certain places in Nigeria, that my British accent, there's a shift there because I don't sound like everybody else. And it's about acknowledging that and understanding how that could perhaps influence a situation. And perhaps that means maybe I'm not the best person to tell that story. Maybe somebody else should tell that story. It's not about, do you know what I mean? It's more about acknowledging your privilege, acknowledging those power dynamics, bringing in more diverse voices. It's not about saying no, if you're not from here, you shouldn't be able to. But then it also, raises the question, why do you want to tell those types of stories? What does make you qualified to tell those type of stories? What is attracting you to this? And I feel like if you genuinely care about, this type of work, you shouldn't feel defensive when those questions are levied at you,
Certainly, Yemisi, I reckon with that, absolutely. Because, it's really bothering when you see people who do not understand the local language and also try to like conduct research or in fact do a robust report about that local context. It's really challenging because, for example, you look back at the genocide in Rwanda, you look at all the clips from BBC and the other major news stations. These were Europeans reporting about this African event. However, they cannot understand the day-to-day interlocutions between the people, like it's between two people or among different communities, and that doesn't give you the thoroughness you need to understand how people imagine certain problems. I mean, you can see them having cutlass and fighting each other, but when they actually speak their local language, you're not going to be able to understand what their intention is beyond what they're actually performing. Like, you need to understand language sometimes to actually thoroughly understand people. So I really reckon with that. And my question is to you, Nels. There is this push among scholars today who are following this in the suit of Ngugi that you need to go back and start writing about African stories in African languages. And it is until you start doing that true decolonization can start happening. So do you think it's really necessary for us as writers to say we're not using English or French, these colonial languages, to express our imaginations or to interrogate African history or African ethnic structuring, that we need to use the local languages? First of all, do you agree with that? And if you do, what are the limitations that you think is going to come up or are going to come up to any such refocusing of how we use language in telling stories?
It's such a deep question. It is such a deep question. So it reminds me of so much. It reminds me of so much. I remember, if I give you, for example, when I got to, so I was a little boy when I first got to Nigeria. I was born in Britain and I was raised in Britain, and I was about 12 years old when I was just one of those naughty African kids in the West who got sent back home, and I got sent to a boarding school in Belfast. And I remember very, very vividly, super vividly, in which kids in my school used to get beaten for speaking in any language other than English. In fact, the exact term they would say was speaking in vernacular is prohibited or is forbidden. And if you did it or so, you get beaten. And when I say beaten, I mean mercilessly beaten. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. But it quickly became normal. It quickly became a situation in which I just thought that was how it was. I never really questioned why it was or so. Or my thing about it was they want their English to be as good as possible. So it was an academic pressure or ambition that was forcing them to treat them like this. And I just remember one of my teachers, a gentleman called Mr. Dixon, one day when, actually I don't know if it was Mr. Dixon, but I'll give him credit for it too, because he was a nice guy on some days. So I just remember one day in which some kids were getting beaten for speaking Yoruba to each other. These are kids in the heart of Yoruba land speaking Yoruba to each other. That's their indigenous language. And they're getting beaten in the assembly for it. And the teacher, who knew better, just whispered to me and said to me that do white children get beaten for speaking English in England? And I just said, nah. He said, and he smiled at me, he gave me this telling smile, like, you see? So what he was basically showing to me was this is basically a fallback to the days of colonialism, and it was to a certain degree. But also at the same time, it was indeed a point of ambition that they wanted to make sure those children could actually speak English as well as possible, so they could be as competitive as possible on the job market, on the international market, in politics, anything they wanted to go in. It was an establishment school, so that's what they're trying to do. So now you then get to this point here where you say to children, you say to a writer to write a book in your own indigenous language. So for me, I would have to be writing a book in Shikiri. There's about 2 million of us, which is a very, very small ethnic group in Nigeria. I don't really speak Shikiri too well. I speak Yoruba fluently. I can write in Yoruba fluently. So I'd have to therefore write the book in Yoruba, which is not my indigenous language by the slightest bit, but I'll just do it. To potentially, it's basically, we're cutting a long story short, there's a way in which we want the world to be, and there's a way in which the world is. And for me to write a book in, say, Yoruba, and then think that how do I get this to translate and sell across the world and everything else, or try and make a living out of it, I would effectively be wasting my time. That it just wouldn't really work. It wouldn't really work. I don't know how long it took Samuel Ajayi Crawford to translate the Yoruba Bible, the Bible into Yoruba. But again, it's just the way it is. It's the way in which the world works. So in principle, in fact, in the ideal world, I actually agree with the argument. But in the pragmatic world in which we all live in, the argument is one that just cannot hold up due to the practical nature of the world. English is a global language. So even if people in places like China, for example, which has 1 billion people, or India and other places, their best and most famous writers all write in English. So yeah, it is. So in terms of actual decolonization conversation, it's a deep one. It's a deep one. But there's more Africans across the world. For example, if I'm writing exclusively for Black people, there's more Africans across the world who speak English than any shared language whatsoever. More than speak French than any shared language whatsoever. So it's so also too, if I wrote a book to say Yoruba, to then translate it from Yoruba to say Urobo or Ijo or Tiv or Benin or Aga or Twi or anywhere else or so, the reality of the matter is that you'll probably be selling about 5, maybe 6 copies per book per translation or so. But if you put it in English, well, shot at multi-million audiences, multi-million. So yeah, so long story short, ideally, I agree 100%. Pragmatically, I just know the world as it is. So it is a bit of a tough one that we just get that. It's almost as if that it's such a fruit of colonialism that ship has sailed so far that it's rendered our own languages almost like mini pursuits just to have it, to know it or so, which is a disastrous thing to have.
Certainly, I mean, it's really it's a sobering fact, particularly if you consider that a lot of, I'm looking at the landmark publications in anthropology, in history, in sociology on, say, for example, the Bamba people or the Mandé people. And this like are publications in English and French, but those publications are seminal. And they do have a lot to do in terms of helping the Bamba people or the Mandé people like understand their antecedent, but they are not in the local language. And of course, majority of these people cannot speak the colonial languages. So it's really sobering. But anyway, I don't know if Yemisi has a response to that, but I also have another question for you, Yemisi. But before that, I just comment by, I think I have a couple of comments in the chat box. There is this one from Eri Ajumeze. They say, interestingly, in the context of today's discussion and others like it, Olufemi Taiwo's book is coming out by the end of the month. Implicit in this argument is the position that decolonization plays into and tacitly agrees with, unwittingly, of course, the notion of modernity as strictly Western and Africans as endless victims of modernity, hence anti-modern. I partly agree with Taiwo. Here in my university, I like to notice that decolonization has become no more than a metaphor or a buzzword. Taiwo's book is titled Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. Thank you for that reminder, Henry. Professor Olufemi Taiwo, for whom you don't know, is a professor of philosophy. I think he's at Cornell, and one of the people I actually admire a lot. He's having a discussion with the Philosopher magazine this weekend. I think if you sort of Google Olufemi Taiwo, the Philosopher magazine, it should pop up. It's going to be an interesting conversation. I thank you, Henry, for bringing that up. It's an interesting, it promised to be an interesting conversation. I think this is a question. Okay, it's from Dalit. They say how we Africans become united and share our culture together, and also how we can make our language and culture more global. Another comment, John Mugabe says, how can we position our culture to suit the current trend of globalization? Globalization has been blamed for cultural erosion in many parts of Africa. Yemisi, you want to help us with that question in addition to if you want to respond to the issue of using African language to tell African stories? Yemisi.
Oh yeah, no, I think Nels summed that up pretty well. So sorry, if you could just repeat that question. Was that about trying to?
Yeah, they say, how can we position our culture to suit the trend of globalization. Globalization has been blamed for cultural erosion in many parts. I guess what they're trying to say, perhaps, is that globalization has been blamed for cascading or sort of burying African realities or stories or languages. But how can we seize that opportunity of globalization to sort of reintegrate our perspective, our stories into the mainstream? Does that sound?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think one of the questions that Anna sort of posed, which I wonder if it's sort of linked towards that, was sort of speaking about, trying to, I guess maybe this is slightly different because her question was about sort of how do we get people to sort of accept or more authentic sort of African stories. And I think for me, it's always sort of, the question is kind of like, who are we doing this stuff for? Are we still sort of centering the white gaze when we're thinking about a lot of this type of stuff? If Africans are interested in African stories, is that enough? Why are we concerned with what the rest of the world is thinking about our storytelling? I always wonder if we're sort of pandering to the white gaze when we're thinking about that type of thing. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question well, but you might need to leave me for a minute to ponder that one over. I wonder if Nels has anything to contribute to that. So I want to be able to answer it properly. So leave it with me for a minute.
So it's funny because in relation to the last question you asked about African writing in African languages, if Yemisi said yes, I was going to demand that she answer her question in Yoruba or in Igbo or so. See how
about writing in.
Absolutely, I was gonna. About the previous question about writing in our indigenous languages, I was going to say you must speak this in your Yoruba dialect.
No, I mean, I think
I want to hear it in Ijebu Yoruba, straightforward. So yeah, please, James, I thought you were going to say something.
No, go for it.
So in relation to the actual question about the last question was just skip
globalization. How can
globalization? So in terms of culture, I think we mustn't mistake the written word for all of our culture, because it's not, because globalization has been useful to our culture. So you take, for example, right now on the actual global scale, we are kind of looking to some degree, we get some bad days, but we are looking better than we have in a very, very long time. So with the rise of, say, Afrobeats, for example, it's become a cultural powerhouse for us, where quite European children who European children who once upon a time saw Africans as, I must give them 50p a month or something, so I must give them 10% of my pocket money or something else like that. Now they're thinking, I want to be like a whiz kid. I want to be able to dance like a Burna Boy. So and I'm curious about what it would be like to go to Ghana for Christmas alongside my African friends. So what we're seeing increasingly is that, as happened, if you look at America, for example, what really made America alluring was actually the globalization of, say, Hollywood. So the globalization of film really helped America promote itself on the global scale and really made people think, that's somewhere where I really want to be. That's where it's happening. That's where I want to go to. And it dragged the best and the brightest and most talented to that place. And what we're seeing now with the actual cultural power of something is Afrobeats and so on and so forth, or it's doing the exact same thing for the Africans. So eventually you'll start seeing that more people, there's the tourism boom. It's actually helping out. And eventually, as you start to see African writers too, when I say tourism boom, I mean Ghana, obviously, not in Nigeria. So Nigeria just...
No, I definitely have a point to make after you've said this.
I'll wrap up. I'll land quickly. when you see the tourism, so when you see everything that's actually potentially happening on the ground around the world, even now over Christmas last year and a couple of months ago, going to see Davido, going to see Burna Boy, going to see Wizkid at the O2, which is one of the biggest arenas in London, was a landmark night for much of London, to the point where tube stations were telling you, go in this direction. And that was pretty much, so it's a big thing. And it's the same way. So America 100 years ago, America 250 years ago, wasn't the America we know today. It took things like the soft power of culture, the actual fascination of the story or so, of the story, for their stories and everything else to go around the world to really drag people in. It took those entrepreneurs, those entertainers, that cultural side of things. It took people thinking, oh, well, I've seen the Benin bronzes here. They're going back home. Well, let me go see them in Nigeria in their proper habitat. Those things, or let me go to Ghana, let me go to all these different places and try and understand these things. that is a very positive thing. It's something that I should potentially welcome. Does globalization have an impact on culture? Yes, it does. Does it eradicate culture in certain places? It might well do, but the key thing about it is that our culture is just like, our culture can't be killed. We always find a way to actually, if you can't get Africa out of your system, it always finds a way to come out into the world. And when it does, it's always a beautiful thing.
Right, absolutely. It's brings to mind this argument I was having with one of my colleagues in education.
Sorry, one second. I think Yemisi was about to say something, and I stopped.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Yemisi.
Oh, no. It was just a response, and I know Nels and I have spoken about this type of stuff a lot. While I agree in terms of soft power, I think we can all agree that the allure of America has certainly worn off. Now, I don't think it's the sort of Mecca that it once was 100 years ago. I also think that this idea, it kind of makes me think of when people sort of show pictures of mansions in Accra and say stuff like, this is the Africa you don't see on TV. It's very pandering, again, to the white gaze. Like, we don't all live in mud huts. Well, a lot of people do live in mud huts on the continent, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I feel like, as much as I understand that crafting a narrative allows people to sort of invest, I feel like we should not be ashamed of certain traditions and cultures and practices that we have. And I think that the aim should not be to craft a narrative that's centered around the white gaze. It should be to craft a narrative that is accurate. So yeah, you do have, people that are out here like Burna Boy, like Wizkid, doing absolutely amazing things on an individual level, but you still have infrastructural failure, you still have terrorism, you still have poverty. Our countries are complicated, and we shouldn't shy away from that. We all accept the complexity of countries like America and of countries like the UK. We can hold two thoughts in our head, that there are rich people in America and there are extremely poor people in America. But only when it comes to the continent, only when it comes to African countries, does it have to be one or the other. There's no nuance there. And that's what I feel is missing around our own stories. It's not about showing only the good side, because that is not a reflective side. It's not about showing only the bad side, because that's also not a reflective side. It's about finding the truth within the middle, and telling the true story of these places. And I think it's interesting that people use Afrobeats as an example, because I think with Afrobeats, before the sort of resurgence, there was a lot of stuff where people were trying to make music that sounded like American music. Same in the UK. A lot of people on the Black British UK music scene were trying to make music that sounded American. It wasn't until people stopped doing that and started catering to the needs of their own audience. With the Burners and the Wizkids and the Davidos, they were making music for Nigerians. It wasn't about whether other people understood the music or whether they connected with the music or whether they liked the music, because it wasn't about them. It was about, this is the music that resonates with us, and this is the music that we like, and this is the music that we enjoy. And the rest of the world caught on. The rest of the world then sort of, okay, actually, we're kind of into this type of stuff. But it wasn't centered around Western acceptance. It wasn't about Western acceptance. And I feel like if we're going to talk about, if we're trying to tell our stories, we should try to sort of follow that mold where we're telling our stories the way we like, the way that suits us, the way that is true to us, and the rest of the world will catch up or not. But our existence should not be focused on whether people understand us or not. And I say that in the knowledge that, what Nels is saying about, getting either tourist money or investment and all of that stuff is important. But I do think that when we're talking about decolonizing, that does also mean sort of decentering the white gaze in all of this.
Right. Just sorry, Nels. Sorry, we are really running out of time, but I would like to get to the audience question. We have a lot of questions here. But before I get to that question,
just say one quick thing.
Hold on, sorry, Nels. You can tie that to the question I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
Apologize for that. I was just going to say, because a lot of our audience are actually, graduate students and undergraduate students. And this point by Yemisi is so important, and we need to explore it further. I would just suggest that whenever I want to actually read this book by Edward Said, entitled Orientalism, it's an interesting book that can help you understand this idea of European gaze over Africans or Middle Easterns, and how we can see people like Burna Boy and Davido as ambassadors of our culture more than politicians are, frankly. So I will actually suggest that. I want to pass it to Anna now to help us go through this question. We have like some questions and comments, and we only have 10 minutes to go. So Anna, could you help us manage this question in sort of a fire brigade approach so we can actually get out of this?
All right, thank you, Ibrahim. We have a few questions. Okay, we have a question, an anonymous attendee, and this person says, do you think that African storytellers will also do enough to highlight Africa's successes and achievements? And is that a form of self-colonization as well? Because we continue to present ourselves to the world as a continent that has not yet widely recovered from the era of colonization. This question is from the same person. Person says, what is wrong? Is the knowledge we possess colonized? Nels, you could just quickly answer that.
I think there's somebody buzzing. I don't know if you can all hear it. Also, it's just my yeah.
Yeah, I can hear it. Yeah.
So and it might be you. So it's not me. I've tried to just move things around. So I think it does. Sorry, could you just briefly repeat the question? I couldn't quite hear it because of the buzzing sound.
All right. Okay. So the person says, do you think that as African storytellers we do enough to highlight African successes? And that if we don't, isn't that a form of self-colonization?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. It does touch on what Yemisi said earlier on. It does, and it's a powerful question too, because again, so in terms of the stories that we tell and how we tell the stories, we have a responsibility. So if I just give you, for example, just touching on what Yemisi said about the Africa you see and the Africa you don't see, it's a very, very important thing. It's a very important juxtaposition. But which America do you see more? Do you see more of Detroit, Michigan, which is actually a poverty-riddled area or so, or do you see more of Beverly Hills on TV? You see much more of Beverly Hills, is of course the answer. And when it boils down to Africans too, one of the problems that we actually have is that far too often, it's not just a matter of the white gaze per se, and although I do get that, it's about economic development gaze too, at the same time, that we're trying to attract people to come and invest in our countries and trying to actually boost and build our economies up. So essentially your soft power is your marketing power, your ability to go out there, and that's the purpose of your culture too. So if every single person you have within our background as writers or so is spawned or scarred by our own country or by our own continent, and then they actually pour that spawn on paper, and it just cascades around and continues to build up or so, it becomes almost a degree of a fulfilling prophecy or a fulfilling anointing, which Africa becomes a place where no one really wants to visit, or it would be just people associated with woe and doom, which is not good for anybody, really and truly. That doesn't attract prosperity. So I think that yes, in terms of the actual colonization aspects of it, the purpose of colonization was to loot and plunder, our resources, our people, and everything else. And leave us in a damaged state, in a weakened state, almost in perpetuity. What we don't want to do is to replicate that via our own means. So therefore, as writers, as creatives, as journalists, and everything else that we do, we all have to be careful with it, and always just have to find some degree of balance. And that's what we do.
Thanks, Nels.
Sorry.
The second question from someone in the audience, Yemisi, if you could just quickly answer that in under a minute or so. President Mahmoud says, how would you evaluate the role of customers and target audience when it comes to having critical takes over these stories, questioning what has been written about Africa and Africans?
Sorry, was that how would you evaluate the role of customers?
The question is in the chat box. Can you see it, Yemisi?
Yeah, how would you evaluate the role of customers and target audience when it comes to critical takes over these stories and questioning whether could an active public perspective help change this landscape for the better? I think that's a really good question. I think it's a really interesting question. I do think that a lot of journalism now tries to sort of put audience concerns and perspectives, they consider them a lot more. As you can see now, if a story goes out that people find offensive or people find it doesn't accurately reflect a particular reality, the writer will hear about it. You'll see it on social media. And a lot of the time, I've had this happen to myself. I've had this happen to colleagues. It doesn't necessarily mean that the story itself will change, but a lot of the time conversations do happen, because as journalists, we don't know everything. As storytellers, we don't know everything. We do need to be informed. I'm not sure how that could work on a more practical level, other than, you know, the sort of feedback that we get. I mean, social media has been a godsend in that respect. Before, you were just kind of putting out stories. You didn't know how people were receiving it. You didn't know whether, you know, people were offended by it. You didn't know. But now you do get that sort of instant real-time feedback. And any good journalist is going to want to reflect on how the story has been received, because ultimately you are creating these stories for an audience. So their perspective matters, their input matters. So I do think that that can help. At the same time, yeah, I'm not sure how that could necessarily be factored in on a day-to-day basis and in a way that's like conducive, because sometimes, you know, some people, they just don't like certain stories, they just don't like certain things to be told. So you don't want to necessarily pander to the audience. You do want their perspective, you do want to hear what people are saying, but not to the point where it's now completely taking over your reporting. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks for that, Yemisi. So before I pass it back to Ibrahim, I'll just read a few comments in that. David says, have different notable writers like Abbey, and others, but most of the works that...
Sorry, Anna.
Yeah.
Apologies. I think this the electronic sound is really overtaking your beautiful voice. So if you may permit me to actually read those comments, please. Yeah, so we have a couple of comments. One from Djibril Diop, pointing people to the work of Che Kanta Diop and how he writes in English, and how everyone should try to read that. There is a comment by Matolino Chanda: we don't pass on knowledge to our fellow Africans the way European or the white world do. We must learn the art of maintaining and improving our stories and knowledge and values. We must respond to the world belief that Africa can't do anything perfect. We have so much to tell and so much positive impact to contribute to the world. There is a comment from Galaxy Tab 7. The height of globalization, it's a form of neocolonization in which there is widespread Americanism and westernized ideological thinking. This platform of globalization provides a validation of other culture, other equally important than others. There's another comment by Amelia. They say, I feel like part of the reason it is so hard to decolonize the telling of African stories is that Africans are already completely colonized, and the road back is bound to be long and hard. The most well-known book about Steve Biko is one by a white journalist, yet so many African writers have written about him. The idea that white people are better than us is deeply embedded in the African community. If we champion our African writers more aggressively than the Western writers, and not just our writers, our artists, innovators, and all our pioneer Africans may actually begin to understand what they are capable of telling their own stories. So there's numerous other comments, but as we round off this discussion, I would like to get your final salvo. Nels, you are an amazing writer. You work with other writers. What do you see to be the future in the very nearest time frame? The future of decolonization of African stories from the perspective of writers. What are the major trends? The things that you think are going to happen very soon, or the things that actually you guys are struggling with?
It's a very good question. It's hard to say. So we're seeing some degree of changes right now. So there's some really good books that have come out recently about the continent and how the continent is a continent as opposed to just a country. There was Dick Wolf-Alayen's Africa is not a country. There is this, which I literally just received off the actual hot press today. It's a book called It's a Continent by Astrid Madimba and Chini Yukata, which is about unraveling Africa's history one country at a time. I know Yemisi has something cooking too. So there's people out there, so do I in the background. So yeah, so there's things happening out there. But I think as it stands right now, if you still go to the bookshelf anywhere, you go to the Africa section, anywhere in the West, you still see majority of books are told by Europeans, are told by Europeans, and not just by Europeans, but for Europeans. So it's Africa, it's the story of Africa by and for Europeans. And sometimes it really does do a really, really huge job in actually in describing us in the worst ways possible. But the key thing about it is that with every book that comes out, everybody who takes a story back, everybody who takes initiative and demands and change the narrative, it's a step in the right direction. And it's and therefore we just keep marching in that direction, hope for the best and work towards the best.
Thank you, Nels. Final salvo from you, Yemisi. I'm assuming majority of our audience, if not all of them, are young journalists. Certainly our writing fellows are young journalists, and they admire individuals like yourself. But generally, what would be your advice to them as regards how they should inculcate decolonial thinking in the way they approach their writings or investigations?
That's a good question. I think, again, acknowledging your privilege, acknowledging the power dynamics in all your relationships with your sources, with your team members, with everybody that you interact with, and in the sort of knowledge production that leads to your story, interrogating that, thinking about, making sure that everybody is like properly credited, that you're following, correct ethical guidelines when dealing with your sources. Think about the way that, sources here are treated, subjects of your stories are treated, making sure that they are afforded the same sort of protections and dignity that, white or non-African subjects would be afforded. And again, understanding that, a lot of us have been colonized, mentally, and it's a process unlearning that behavior, and it's a long and consistent sort of journey that we all have to be on. But the first step is actually acknowledging your position, where you're coming from, and then committing to do better and unlearning.
Certainly, positionality is very important. So we will have to leave it at that. We're actually out of time. I want to thank you so much, Nels, Abbey, for your amazing contribution, and of course to the amazing Yemisi Adegoke for the job you're doing and for inspiring a lot of young writers across the continent, and also to Professor Bernard Matolino for some reason he couldn't join us for the majority of the conversation, and we hope to bring him on at some other time. And to my amazing colleague Anna Suberu, thank you so much for your co-anchoring, and of course to our audience for your attendance and your questions and beautiful comments. We hope to continue this conversation on social media. You can follow Yemisi Adegoke and Nels Abbey on their Twitter platforms, and myself as well. I try to be active, and of course my colleague Anna Suberu. So with that, on behalf of African Students for Liberty, I want to thank you everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Bye.